Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we maintain our curiosity, embrace skepticism, and never stop asking, what's really going on beneath the surface? So last week on Taste Test Thursdays, our episode was called The Deluded Brain. I prepared you for this episode by discussing why control feels safe, certainty feels holy, and complexity feels threatening. So if you missed out, please check that out. It's short and sweet. Now, for today's episode, let me ask you something. Why does your body feel like it's on high alert, even when nothing is happening? Why do you either trust too quickly or not at all and end up anxious, burned out, and ashamed in relationships? Why is it so damn hard to regulate your emotions, especially when you're great at controlling everything else? If those questions hit a little close to home, this episode is for you. So last season, we dove into complex trauma through Pete Walker's book, From Surviving to Thriving, and we were unpacking all sorts of topics like how childhood neglect, emotional abuse, and developmental trauma shapes adult patterns. And today, we're going even deeper through the lens of neuroscience. Because what if these aren't personality quirks or moral failings? What if your brain and body are actually doing their best to protect you, using adaptations wired by complex PTSD? My guest today is Cody Isabel. He's a neuroscience researcher and writer whose work has become a game changer in the trauma conversations. He holds a degree in cognitive behavioral neuroscience, has training in internal family system psychotherapy, and specializes in an emerging field of psychoneuroimmunology, which is the study of how your thoughts, brain, and immune system interact. In his Substack article, PTSD and Complex PTSD are not the same thing, it was one of the most clearest, most validating reads on this topic that I found. So if you've ever felt stuck, shut down, reactive, misunderstood, or like your nervous system has a mind of its own, please stay with me. Because we're not just talking trauma. We're talking about nervous system intelligence. We're talking identity repair. We're talking real embodied healing. And before we get into that, I want to bring a few threads from past episodes because they're all woven into this conversation. These are complex topics, so you might want to check the blog to check out some photos and the links that I've included while you're listening. So we talked about fawning, the lesser-known trauma response that shows up as chronic people-pleasing, self-abandonment, and conflict avoidance, especially common in those of us who have survived high-control environments. And that episode was called Unraveling the Impact of Stress on Chronic Health with Teresa Piella. In this episode with Teresa, we also explored the stress cycle, which I mentioned in today's episode. So your body moves through 3 stages when facing ongoing stress. 1, alarm, 2, resistance, and eventually exhaustion. And fawning, while it is behavioral, it can easily become your nervous system's go-to tactic, especially during prolonged stress or in the presence of power dynamics that seem or feel threatening. And we've talked about emotional hijacks in many episodes before and how trauma impacts the brain. You can check that out, called Emotional Hijacks and Nutritional Hacks, Unveiling the Amygdala Secrets, with my buddy Jay, and all of these are linked in the show notes. We've also referenced the vagus nerve, but not specifically polyvagal theory. And today he mentions it and we're diving deeper. Polyvagal theory looks at seeing your stress responses. Instead of malfunctions, it reframes them as adaptive survival strategies. Your nervous system isn't betraying you, it's trying to protect you. It's just working off of old wiring. Podcast listeners, in the show notes, there's a photo of the polyvagal chart if you want to read along with me as I talk about it. So your nervous system is constantly scanning for cues of safety or for threat. And this is called neuroception. And this is internal and external, inside or outside your body. And based on what it detects, your body is just going to shift into different states, and each of them have a biological purpose. And so in the polyvagal chart, it breaks it into 3 major states. The first one is ventral vagus vagal, which is social engagement, the feeling of safety. This is going to be your rest and connect or rest and digest zone. You're going to feel grounded, calm, curious, and open. You can be present with yourself and with others. And this is where your body prioritizes digestion, immune function, bonding hormones like oxytocin. Basically, you're feeling regulated. This is the state we're meant to live in most of our time, but trauma, chronic stress, or inconsistent caregiving can knock us out of it. So number 2 is the sympathetic, fight or flight, or the danger zone. So when your system detects danger, it's going to flip into high alert, alert. Blood rushes to your limbs, your heart races, your digestion shuts down. You're either fight, like rage or irritation, or flee, anxiety or panic. And this is survival mode. It is not rational, it's reactive. And if that still doesn't resolve the threat, is we're going to move into number 3, dorsal vagal freeze or life threat. And so this is the deepest shutdown. Your system says, this is too much, I can't. You go numb, you collapse, you may disassociate, feel hopeless, or emotionally flatline. And this isn't weakness. It's your nervous system pulling the emergency brake to conserve energy and protect you. And here's what's crucial to understand. The theory says that these responses aren't choices. They're biological defaults. And many of us might be stuck in loops of fight, flight, or freeze because our systems never got a chance to complete the stress cycle and return to safety. So, instead of shaming yourself for overreacting or shutting down, what if you asked, what is my nervous system trying to do for me right now? What does it need to feel safe again? That shift from judgment to curiosity is the beginning of healing. And we'll connect this to another major thread, attachment systems, which we haven't really unpacked in depth yet, but we absolutely need to. And he mentions attachment theory very casually in this episode, and I'm assuming most of you have heard about attachment styles. And so your attachment system is the biological and psychological mechanisms that drive us to seek safety, closeness, and emotional connection, especially when you're under stress. And it develops in early childhood through repeated interactions with our caregivers, shaping how you regulate your emotions, perceived threats, and relate to others. So if caregivers were emotionally attuned, predictable, and responsive, you likely formed a secure attachment. Lucky you. But if they were inconsistent, neglectful, controlling, or chaotic, your attachment system learned to adapt in many ways that might have kept you feeling safe then, but cost you connection now. So in a book I'm currently reading, The Happiness Hypothesis, Jonathan Haidt, who's the author of The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of American Mind, the books I talk about almost every episode, point to a disturbing moment in psychological history that disrupted the natural development of secure attachment. And this was the rise of behaviorism in early 20th century. So John B. Watson was a founding figure in behaviorism, and he famously applied the same rigid, mechanistic principles that he used on rats to raising human children. In his 1928 bestseller, The Psychological Care of Infant and Child, he urged parents not to kiss their children, not to comfort them when they cried, or to withhold affection, believing emotional bonding would produce weak, dependent adults. So by the mid-20th century, attachment theory began to challenge these behaviorist claims. John Bowlby in the 1950s argued that infants form emotional bonds with caregivers as innate survival mechanism, not merely as conditioned responses to rewards, as behaviorism suggests. His work, drawing on ethology, psychoanalysis, and control systems theory, moved beyond behaviorism's narrow stimulus response framework. Mary Ainsworth empirical research in the 1960s and 70s through her Strange Situation study confirms that attachment styles stem from caregiver sensitivity and infant security needs, rather than simple conditioning. Yet, ironically, during the 70s and 80s, Christian parenting teachings, particularly those popularized by figures like Dobson, adopted and amplified the very behaviorist ideas that attachment research was already disproving. These teachings emphasize strict discipline, emotional control, often citing scripture to justify practices that were rooted in outdated psychological theories rather than theology. So let that sink in. For decades, the dominant parenting advice discouraged emotional responsiveness, treating affection not as a necessity, but as a liability. That wasn't just bad advice. It was the psychological equivalent of nutritional starvation. Instead of missing vitamins, children missed attunement, safety, and connection. As attachment research has since shown, those early emotional experiences shape nervous system development, stress regulation, and whether someone grows up trusting or fearing closeness. So, when we talk about stress responses like fawning or chronic overfunctioning or emotional dysregulation, we've often just seen the adult expression of a nervous system that never learned what safety feels like in the presence of other people. And that's why today's conversation matters. Because healing isn't just about rewiring thought patterns. It's about rebuilding your felt sense of safety in your body, in your relationships, and in your life. And if you're anything like me, you have found yourself wondering why your nervous system reacts the way it does, or why regulating your emotions feels impossible even when you know better. This episode will connect the dots in ways that are both validating and eye-opening. We're talking trauma, identity, neuroplasticity, stress, survival, and what it really means to come home to yourself. We're going to explore topics like the critical differences between PTSD and complex PTSD and how they impact the brain and body. Why complex PTSD is not just a fear response, but a full body survival adaptation that reshapes your identity, what it means to heal from the bottom up, and why insight alone isn't enough, how books and language can validate our experience without replacing the need for somatic work, and the push-pull relational safety, why complex PTSD makes connection feel risky even when we crave it. And lastly, how trauma affects the default mode network, and why healing often feels like a rediscovering of who you are. So whether you're navigating relational triggers, spiritual disorientation, or a long road of recovery, this conversation, I hope, will offer you clarity, compassion, and a grounded path forward. Please enjoy the interview. All right, everybody. I am here with Cody, who is someone that I follow on Substack, and you guys are going to love this conversation. As I've said in the intro, we're going to be talking about the difference between complex PTSD and PTSD. And so can you just kick it off with, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of the episode, how about you just introduce yourself? Like, who are you and what led you here to be writing about these complex subjects on Substack?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Cody Isabel. My background, I have a degree in cognitive behavioral neuroscience. I am trained in something called internal family system psychotherapy, which is a form of trauma therapy. And I started in this space by creating content around abusive relationships. I was in one myself. And the healing journey to get out of that, what it does to the brain, what it looks like in the brain. My initial fascination with inflammation and trauma of the brain started in college. I had a couple concussions, so I started studying physical brain trauma, and then was more interested in how physical trauma and emotional trauma are kind of similar, or look similar when you look at like what's going on in the brain. So that was fascinating. And I've just been studying something called psychoneuroimmunology ever since, which is how your nervous system, your psychology, or like your mind, your immune system, your endocrine system, how all of those complex systems work together to manifest some of the challenges that people who are struggling with trauma, anxiety, depression, addiction, stress, what's going on in their bodies, their brains, and their minds. And so I started there making content around, again, abusive relationships and how to heal after them. And then slowly started to realize I'm really, really passionate about helping inside of that niche, what I call anxious achievers or anxious overachievers, which also stems from trauma. And so the anxious but ambitious among us generally start or have gone through something traumatic, whether they know it, big or little T trauma, or PTSD or complex, and they have some really specific core wounds that drive them, and helping them half on the business side, half on the personal side is something that I've started to realize, I'm actually really good at helping people with this. So what I do now is really do that trauma work, but with content creators and helping them create, or creatorpreneurs, entrepreneurs, people who are trying to use content and marketing to spread their message, get impact, and make money, obviously. And so it's half helping them monetize their brand without sacrificing their mental and emotional health. So it's half business strategy, all that kind of stuff, content creation, and half mental and emotional health support. So it's been a wild journey, but it's been a fun time. And that's how I kind of got where I'm at here. And Substack is a part of that ecosystem for me.
Yeah, Substack is a really cool platform. I'm kind of late to the game. I started last year, but didn't really dive in until I guess the beginning of this year. So super late to the game. Wish I was here sooner. So thank you for all of that. I am somewhat relatively new to some of these concepts, but I'm very intrigued by it, like the concept of hope molecules, the myokines in your blood just by going for a walk and learning how movement can stimulate, antidepressant stuff. And we've all heard some of that kind of concepts, but what we're talking about goes even deeper than that and not some of the basic stuff. So let's just kick it off, because there's a lot of confusion between PTSD and complex PTSD. They're often used like they're the same thing interchangeably. That's definitely not the case. So can you just walk us through key definitions or the key differences perhaps between them and how they both show up and what's actually happening in the brain?
Yeah, for sure. So the easiest, most simple way to think about it is PTSD is generally from a single event, whereas complex PTSD is from repeated long-term exposure to something traumatic. So PTSD could be something like a natural disaster, active shooter, a house fire, something like that. Single event. On average-ish, 20-ish% of people who experience something like that will develop PTSD, traditional post-traumatic stress disorder. War is another super obvious example I didn't give. 20-ish again percent will lead to some type of post-traumatic stress disorder, which can lead to all sorts of traditional things you hear traditionally in relation to PTSD, which is like flashbacks, panic attacks, dissociation, many memory like fragmentation, where you're trying to think about what's going on or what happened, but you can't really piece it together beginning, middle, end. And that's because your hippocampus, which is the memory center of your brain, dysfunctions during traumatic events. And your amygdala is putting in tons of emotionally charged chemicals into those memories. So they don't store in your hippocampus like a traditional memory, beginning, middle, end. So they are fragmented memories. Literally, they're stored that way in your neocortex, or where your memories are stored. They're created in the hippocampus and they shift out into your neocortex over time. And then hypervigilance is another really common one as well. So that's traditional PTSD. Complex PTSD has all of those wonderful symptoms, in addition to some others. So complex trauma, people often talk about this in relation to childhood trauma. It doesn't have to be just from childhood trauma. Again, I mentioned I come from abusive relationships, and that can be, and I believe actually is, complex trauma as well. Even in adulthood, does it probably mirror patterns and adaptions and things like that from when you were younger? Absolutely, probably 100%. But you can also go through an abusive relationship and that be something that's more considered complex trauma. It's prolonged over time. So it could be neglect, it could be emotional abuse, it could be physical abuse. Those types of things that are prolonged over time could lead to this sense of complex trauma, which comes with all sorts of different things, chronic, depending on when it happens. If it happens when you're young, your brain could be just literally rewired in a different way, or wired initially in a different way than most other people. If it happens when you're a little bit older, you still will see some of the other effects, like emotional dysregulation. There's a lot of your sense of self takes a hit with complex PTSD because there's so long for so consistently. Like think of an abusive relationship, you're just being told, you're being gaslit, or you're being told that this happened when it didn't, or that you're not good enough, or that no one loves you, or that no one, like those types of things. So it affects your self-concept. It messes with your attachment system almost always. And so you struggle with emotional connection and emotional attachment in general. It can dysregulate them. Even if you start as a secure attachment, attachments can change. So you could shift to any of the other three, anxious avoidant, any of those ones. There's emptiness and despair that can come. Again, the self-esteem and confidence is another really, really big one, because it's been for so long that your brain has just been being like shit on, essentially, that it just destroys your ability to believe in yourself and have that self-esteem and confidence. And then there's all of the body symptoms as well. There's all sorts of body symptoms where trauma isn't, I don't believe trauma is stored in the body, but I do believe that it could be expressed through the body. And that's something that is absolutely present in complex PTSD because of the prolonged exposure, but also you can see that in PTSD too.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because obviously when it comes to trauma, it is a, hot to trot word all over social media as you work with content creators. So you know that it can be oversimplified, overgeneralized. We have pop psychology. And so it's really important to not lose the importance and the meaning of these conversations, even if that is the case. And The Body Keeps Score is a very popular book. And I think that it has some key elements. I'm not a big fan of the book. I think it really oversimplifies a lot of things. I don't know how you feel about it, but I wanted to say one thing. Hello, overachiever. Coming from my intense childhood background, I can relate to a lot of, I linked another article that we're not really discussing today, but you literally spoke directly to these overachievers and some signs and symptoms. So I'll link that in the show notes if you related to that when Cody mentioned that in the beginning, guys. But when I was in massage school, we did talk about some of this woo-woo stuff that people would be on the massage table and they would just cry. Sometimes they would laugh. And so there's some things we don't understand. And I love, in the new field that you're studying and how all these systems intersect and impact one another, there's a lot we still don't know. So can you talk a little bit more about maybe, and I didn't really prepare you for this, but I'm sure you're savvy about where that misinformation is, why people, you say it's not stored in the body, but it does show up in the body. So can you tease that out a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I wrote a whole blog on this. I love it. I love this topic. The book that you mentioned is one of the best places or where I would suggest that it probably started. Maybe it didn't start there, but that's where it became popularized. I would that and therapies like somatic experiencing and body focused therapies, trauma yoga, different things like that, where they're clinicians and therapists that are trying to, and I've been there. I work with clients too. So I understand that metaphors can be super helpful in healing and really helpful when you're doing client work. So I get that. The scientist side of me is like, okay, a metaphor is not a mechanism though. Okay. And so that's where I think this concept of somatic memory, meaning body memory, kind of comes in, and the metaphor makes sense because it's like, okay, my jaw is super tight. That's my body. My shoulders are super tight. I'm stressed. Like, my stomach hurts when I'm anxious. Right. So you feel these things and you're like, but it's there. And yeah, I get it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is like stored there in a specific mechanistic way, in the way that, the Body Keeps a Score, that just even the title, suggests that it might. The way that I like to think about it is that the brain keeps the score, but the body is the scoreboard. And so your body, your mind, brain, and body are separate but inseparable. They are all one thing, right? And so when you go through trauma, your nervous system rewires everything. Like everything is rewired. It's an entire body thing. Your autonomic nervous system gets dysregulate your HPA axis, your prefrontal cortex, your hippocampus, your amygdala. All these different things are just going wild when you go through trauma. And psychoneuroimmunology, endocrinology, psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology, whatever, studies not just the mind, brain, and body, but also your nervous system and endocrine system, because your immune system can be increased or decreased, your gut-brain axis, your muscle metabolism, your mitochondrial health. All of these things are affected, and there's imprints, and your brain changes based on trauma. So it can really feel like trauma is stored in the body. But in reality, it is expressed through the body, is the way that I kind of like to describe it. It's more like a readout of your nervous system's wiring, the trauma-informed or trauma-influenced wiring that it laid down. But it's not storage. It's more like it's signaling than it is anything. So does that make sense, big picture?
Oh yeah, I really like that take that, your brain keeps the score and your body is the scoreboard. I think that
Hmm.
really does, tease that out a little bit more. And it made me think about when we're talking about fitness and nutrition, the calories in, calories out model. I talk about that, how it's too reductionistic, meaning your cells do not have a calculator within them being like, boop, 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 boop. All right, so there's a little bit more like all these systems are impacting one another, especially when we're in menopause, perimenopause, hormone. So it's very fascinating. Insulin, lots of hormones are going to impact that. So let's go back to what you said about complex PTSD, because you said, it has all the fun symptoms of PTSD and more. And we have talked about how trauma, and we talked about the amygdala hijacking before, emotional hijacks before, just Pete Walker's work. He did say he'll come on my podcast someday, and I'm just going to freak out when
Hey.
not to like idolize him, but I have read all of his books. So low key would be super stoked to pick his brain. So let's talk about how complex PTSD, it doesn't just hijack your fear response. You've said it before. Well, it depends on, like, I was raised in a abusive, neglectful environment as a child. So my brain formed in that way. I don't want to overshare too much, but my mom said that I would hold my breath until I passed out when I was 2. So pure rebellion, trying to fight back. So that shows me and that's just a little taste of some of me trying to fight back against my mom. So how does understanding how the nervous system is rewired, or how our sense of self could be fractured. So let's not, maybe you could speak to like childhood, but we could also just speak generally, like you said. And I've been in an abusive relationship in my adult life. And I was just reflecting to my husband, I think that did actually exacerbate so much. So I might have been fine in life until that experience in my mid-20s that kind of dug up some stuff from the past. So maybe you could touch on a mixture of that. I gave you a lot.
Yeah. I mean, it completely changes the way that you perceive the world, look at the world, and your nervous system as you are a young, developing little brain until 25-ish, 20s for women, 25, 30-ish, around about for men. Our brains are growing. When we're young, we have more neurons than we ever will in our entire lives. Are something called your glial cells, your mitochondria, or your not mitochondria, your microglia, and all sorts of different support cells in the brain are pruning away different connections and things like that. And your neural architecture is being built, like the literal structure of your brain, how things are interconnected, how your salience network is connected with your default mode network and your executive function network, and all of these different things are being wired and fired and connected together. Trauma can affect these things, and some. I don't necessarily like this concept because, again, it's another metaphor, but maybe not the best mechanistic concept. But some people consider or suggest that trauma can leave holes in the brain, like giant gaps in neuronal connections or synapses, or less myelination, meaning the insulation around neurons, essentially, that makes it harder for your neurons to communicate effectively and efficiently. Or even the different levels of, that would be white matter, gray matter, cell bodies, like less cell bodies in different, in certain regions of your brain and things like that. So that's one thing. Your attachment system, which is represented in your nervous system, is one of the biggest things. So all of that stuff is like the network neuroscience. If we zone in on the attachment system, as you're growing up, this is so important. This is like, we are born, and if we were left on the table left our own devices, we would die.
Right.
We have to form attachments when we're children before we can even remember these things. We have to form these connections, and so it's truly life or death for us when we're young. And this attachment system helps us attune with caretakers and people around us and adapt in whatever way we need to adapt to survive. And if you don't have a healthy attachment and don't have a healthy environment you're growing up in, that attachment system wires and fires itself to specific adaptions, whether it's people pleasing or depending on whatever different trauma you're going through. It could be people pleasing, it could be anxiety, it could be a really bad inner critic, it could be drugs, sex, alcohol, porn, it could be suicidal thoughts, it could be self-harm, like all of these different adaptive mechanisms that whichever one ends up working the best to keep away really bad, terrible traumas, like let's pretend abandonment, Let's just go with
Right.
abandonment, like core wound of abandonment. So you people please. And if that works when you're young to help you stay safe and connected and calm and get what you need to survive, that adaptive mechanism lives inside of you. Adults are just kids wearing costumes. We're all just adapted children.
Right.
These adapted children try to get into relationships with one another, and
Yeah.
like they crash and burn for surprise, surprise. They're running survival mechanisms. They're not in their true self.
Right.
And so that's those patterns that started when we were super, super young, those protective patterns, we truly, truly just run them over and over and over again throughout our lives, until we break the cycle, until we learn how to get out of those loops and update those parts of us, that we're no longer young. We're not that age anymore. We're in a different environment. We have new resources. We have new people around us. And it's okay to relax. You're here now. You're able to help, as opposed to them having to do the job that they picked up for you during a traumatic moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, like, for example, if you were a young child or a baby who was taught or heard, kids should be seen, not heard, or, some of these other neglectful tropes that were common. And when I grew up, I was born in 1985. Then you might, or I was sent to my bedroom if I was expressing any negative emotion. So I was, abandoned when I needed some help, some comfort. And so that might be some examples of where that abandonment wound, which is one of mine, can come up very easily. Even if I just feel dismissed in a conversation, it's interesting how once I notice that it's like that tune in your head is another phrase that Dr. Mark Gregory Karras, who's a researcher in the deconstruction kind of religious world. His work is amazing, but talking about how it's like almost like a tune that you hear in your head, starting to name that tune or notice that it's kind of this record that's being put on, and you can create that fork in the road, or for another metaphor, which, they're not mechanistic, but creating like noticing you're putting the record on is getting ahead of that pattern, be like, oh, wait a minute, I can maybe tune to a different beat and shift this up. So I love Jonathan Haidt's work, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics, The Happiness Hypothesis, The Coddling of American Mind. I don't know if you've heard of any of his works. He's a moral psychologist. Okay, so in The Happiness Hypothesis, he just told me about, in chapter 6, John B. Watson, who is a leading figure in behaviorism. He advanced that minimal of physical affection towards children in his book in 1928. So he was telling parents to treat children with emotional detachment, emphasizing routine and discipline over affection. And so I'm going to be interviewing some authors later this summer talking about Christian parenting and, spare the child, spare the rod. But I was interested because wait a minute, that was in the 1980s, but this was in 1928. So I wanted to just touch on these concepts were being taught by science, by leaders in the industries at that time. So trying to find compassion for how do we get here? How are parents getting some of this information? I just found that so fascinating. One of my random rabbit holes this week on that was who was influencing my parents, which is why they raised me in that certain way. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, because it's kind of random, but I thought was applicable to what we were just talking about.
Yeah, I think it speaks to science communication in general and science in general. Just because you have a PhD or you're a scientist does not mean boots in the ground, what is right or wrong. And also, just because you've done some research or there is some research supporting one hypothesis or one way of doing something doesn't mean that it's proven. It might be research might suggest it, or it might lean towards that. But research is so much more nuanced. There's for almost every hypothesis you have, every theory, every parenting, whatever, every trauma theory, there's 50 papers on this side and 50 papers on the other side that say the exact opposite thing. So it's it's really hard, and it's really hard to communicate that nuance, because you see it a lot in nutrition too. Everyone should do a carnivore diet. Everyone should do a vegan diet. Everyone should do, but that's not how we work. We are infinitely complex. Between the two of us, each of us has 1,000 trillion, a quadrillion synapses between our ears. I mean, that's unfathomable. It would take you 36 million years to count to that number. That's wild. And so we are just so infinitely complex that this reductionist everything, this works for every single person, or this has research, therefore you have to do this, really frustrates me, and is something that I have to come up against a lot when I'm working.
Same as, being in, we actually had someone on in a season 3 who is a biostatistician and a nutritionist, one of my online friends who lives in South Africa. So I was like the best accent, super cute.
Nice.
And talking about, the limitations of, nutrition research. And you can see it on the bag of like a pistachio nuts. It says science supports, but doesn't prove that eating a handful of nuts can like reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. So it's like right there where they can't claim it's proven. So that just made me, chuckle a little bit. So, we do appreciate and respect science. Hello, look at us. We appreciate the research, but we can fall into this, like, I guess it's the desire for certainty. It's a core craving for the brain, as you would probably know more because you're the expert. So it's like a sale, an appeal that we all crave, I would say, is what. But I love what you said. Just because you have a PhD doesn't mean you should be able to it's not always 100% proven. And it kind of leads me back to what I wanted to say about the concept facts don't heal the tracks, as Dr. Mark Gregory Karras said in season 2. It's kind of a similar concept, like trying to have hold of facts and being so stuck on certainty is not actually, you can't always just journal or affirmation or think your way out of complex PTSD. So can you just break that down a little bit? What do you mean when you say, and my listeners are aware of somatic healing. We're interested in some of these concepts, EMDR, bilateral stimulation, brain spotting, some of those techniques, if that's maybe what you're talking about. So what do you mean when you say healing from the bottom up? And how does that differ more than cognitive, like CBT or insight-based approaches? And not that we're hating on those, because they can be insightful.
Yeah, for sure. The biggest delineation that I have is, if you think of your mind, your brain, and your body, again, they're separate but inseparable. Okay, so if you're thinking of your mind at the current moment, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectic behavioral therapy, some of these top down, they're kind of working in the mind. Oh, you have an automatic negative thought, an ant. I'm not good enough. Let's turn that into a pet, a positive, empowering thought. And the concept is that will, that shifting that cognitive distortion will help you a lot. And dude, it does. I am not here to shoot down cognitive therapies or top down therapies at all. My degree is in cognitive behavioral neuroscience. I study the science behind these things. So I'm not shooting those down at all. However, getting a little bit past the surface level and getting into the deeper traumas, and going to those parts. I am IFS, like preaching from the mountaintops my whole life. I love it. And IFS blends top down and bottom up because it looks for where these traumatic events are being expressed in your body, and helps you find them in or around your body, and start to work through those things. Somatic experiencing takes it a step further, where it's like, or even like something like trauma yoga, for example, takes it a step further where it gets super far into your body, and they are trying to find what's in your hips and what's in your low back and what's in your shoulders. And in my opinion, they get into that, like, oh, it's stored in the body concept a little bit, which again, if it's helping someone, okay. If you're trying to make a claim, some mechanistic claim, there's not enough science there yet. So that would be a really hard claim to make, but they're more focused on the body and the responses that were stored there, the incomplete defense mechanisms, or the incomplete patterns or activation patterns that are going on in those moments of high stress, high trauma, and helping you complete those and work through those. On one hand, the other hand is creating safety in your body. And this is where kind of polyvagal comes in. And this is where I really like to blend polyvagal theory in IFS and some somatic stuff. Polyvagal theory is the concept that your nervous system has a couple different states, green, yellow, and red. Green is your calm, cool, collected, rest and digest system. Yellow is your sympathetic state, and red is your free state, where you're like so activated, your parasympathetic nervous system actually comes back online and shuts everything down. Most people go from green to yellow, green to yellow, green to yellow. If I'm at the bottom of some stairs, I walk up some stairs, I have to go into my yellow sympathetic zone to get up those stairs and put blood into my muscles. And then once I get to the top of the stairs, I can drop back into green and recover, pull the lactic acid out, all that kind of stuff. That's a normal pattern. People who go through trauma oftentimes get shot up further into that yellow zone, so high sometimes that they don't go all the way back down to green, and they actually get activated again and pushed up into red. And so PTSD, if we bring it all the way back to that, could be someone shooting all the way up to red in one crazy traumatic event and then going through the recovery process is getting back down to green. Complex PTSD is starting in green and then going up to yellow and coming to green, going further into yellow, getting less into green, going further into yellow, less into green, and eventually, slowly over time, building to a place where they are hyperactivated and they have laddered their way up into the red zone. And so understanding that about your nervous system, when you're thinking about the body and you're thinking about healing, you've got to create safety. You've got to get you've got to calm yourself down, bring your nervous system back down to that green state. And so one of the biggest issues that people have when they're trying to heal trauma, when they're trying to do trauma work, is they talk about it, but they're not doing anything to create safety in their body. They're not doing anything to turn on their parasympathetic nervous system and get to that green state. And no one's telling them that when you're in a red state, you have to go through yellow to get back to green. So you will feel more activated. You will feel more anxious, nervous, worried, scared, angry before you feel better necessarily, or not necessarily better, but in green. And a tall tale sign of this, I see it all the time, especially in anxious disorders, is they're like, I pass out when I go to bed, but then I wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning with racing thoughts. I'm like, okay, this is because you go into a small coma and your body is like knocking you out because you're so activated. And then over the course of the night, you're dropping down the activation curve. And when you hit that yellow sympathetic state, a big shot of cortisol, adrenaline, epinephrine, these things shoot into your blood, and you wake up and you're in this anxious state because you're coming down the deactivation curve, but counterintuitively, it feels like you're going up it. And so if you don't understand that nuance and you can't create safety in your body to help it get through that weird phase, going back from yellow down to green, from red, it can be really, really hard to have any healing that gets accomplished because you're not in a safe space. If your external environment isn't safe, if you're still in the traumatic environment, your nervous system is going to stay closed up. The way I like to think about it is if trauma is like I have a little chicken to remind me not to be a chicken. But if the trauma is the chicken and it's in between my hands, you've got to open up. If you're in an external environment that's scary, it's going to stay closed up like this. If you get your external environment healthier, you're around better people, you're around better, you're out of the abusive or the traumatic situation, your nervous system opens up a little bit and you can start to see inside just a tiny bit. Then you start to create internal safety and start to do parts work like IFS, right? And start to get to know your internal parts and start to understand these deeper traumas, and your nervous system can open all the way up and show you what that piece of what that trauma is, what got stored back in there so long. And then IFS has a process for being able to pull that trauma out of that traumatic memory without having to re-experiencing it and getting to witness it instead of re-experiencing it, and pull it out and fill it back up with positive self-led things or self-energy type things. So that's kind of the blending process of top down versus bottom up. Top down would say, oh, let's talk about the trauma. Tell me the story of your thing. But again, we just talked about how trauma is stored in fragments.
Right.
There's no beginning, middle, end. So we like that just is re-traumatizing.
Circles. Yeah. And that's what like EMDR has, mixed bag results because, you'll have to pick a specific, event and work through it and basically potentially re-traumatize yourself going through that, or even just talk therapy. There's, if you have complex PTSD, you will literally not only probably continue to stay regulated and you'll also activate the person you're talking to as well. You could potentially get them amped up as well. So from what I understand in regards to one of my fitness mentors was talking to me about one of the reasons we see an increase in obesity is also because my dogs are being like really loud in the background. If you can hear them, I have 3. We were not finishing the stress cycle. So let's say, we're at work, we have all these cortisol spikes because we have these emails coming through. We're, stressed out, but then we're not able to, because, we don't get, our biology doesn't get an iOS update like our iPhones do. So if we were back in the, days getting chased by a lion, your system should be able to respond well to stressful events and come back down. But when we're at these constant levels of threats or these, environments like you were just saying, then that's where the iOS update hasn't happened. The body doesn't understand that these threats they're just an email. It's not life or death. And so that's really where our systems get offline. And so I really appreciate where that's why talk therapy and some of these things might not really help you get back online. But then some of these other therapies that are so somatic and so based aren't going to actually help you put to words some of the things that are happening. So I've heard of internal family systems. We've had somebody on the podcast who does EFT tapping, emotional freedom tapping, which I think is a little bit more, it's better because you don't have to go revisit trauma. It can work on the meridians. I find it very interesting. But she's a big fan of internal family systems and just noticing these fragmented parts of yourself and really just stepping into wholeness is going to be, converging those two. So I appreciate you, not looking down on either one, but seeing how they might just not be the whole picture together and how we have to kind of tease this out a little bit more. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And so what would you say? What are some of your, obviously we're not asking for specific advice, but what are some go-to approaches that you recommend for some of your clients, for example?
Yeah. So I blend internal family systems with, cognitive neuroscience, like neuroscience and nervous system regulation and brain research, brain tools. The steps that I articulated really are like external safety, internal safety, and then starting to do some of that parts work. I'm again very IFS based, and so just starting to name these parts can really help people a ton because they can start to say, "Oh, that's my blank part," or "Oh, that's Billy Bob, my angry part," or "My anger," or "My critic's name is Jerry." Right? I just name them different kind of funny things, and like you were saying earlier, that really helps me notice the record or notice the tune that's playing that you were describing, but really understand it as a part of me that is probably single digits years old, that is doing its best to protect me in some way, even if I can't understand it right now. And so getting to know that part and forming a relationship with that part of you, which sounds kind of weird at first, but is actually super, 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 super helpful. And just starting to ask it some questions like, what do you want me to know or understand about you? What is your intention or hope for me? And having this conversation, the very first thing that can really help a lot with this is something called unblending. So when you're like yourself, like the seat of your consciousness, who is actually running the show is like my fist. Your parts are like my hand that cover my fist. And when they're completely covering my fist and my fist is engulfed in my hand, it's impossible to see your true self. These are your parts when they're super blended and activated. You can ask your parts to unblend and just give you a little tiny bit of space between your fist and your hand and ask them to step back just a little bit so that they're not completely engulfing you anymore and have this conversation. And I know it feels weird, but if you just pretend, just imagine that you could do it. You don't have to think about it. You just have to pretend you can do it. And these parts will show up and you'll hear these things where maybe it's a picture, maybe it's a sound, maybe it's a movie, maybe it's a smell, maybe it's a feeling, who knows? But start to have these conversations with these protectors first is what I absolutely suggest people start to do. And the best thing to do is just think about sabotaging type behaviors, whether it's anxiety, whether it's people pleasing, whether it's beating yourself up as your inner critic, maybe it's your achiever, or maybe it's the more shamed ones like drugs, sex, alcohol, porn, addictions of any kind, rage. Start to look at those two groups of protectors. There's a specific name for them in IFS, but we don't have to go there. And just start to get to know them and what they're protecting. Because protectors protect exiles, those big traumatic things you don't want to feel: emotional pain, rejection, abandonment, neglect, terror, sexual trauma. Those types of things are stored and locked away, and our protectors are guarding them. So the better you get to know your protectors, you can start to understand how old they are and what they're protecting and what they're afraid would happen if they didn't do their job. And that is a great roadmap for the deeper trauma work that the exile work should absolutely be done with a professional. That can get a little dicey and can be scary to do on your own. I have my own IFS therapist that I do that stuff with. I know how to do this stuff. I have done it thousands of times. I'm very confident, but even with my own system, I have someone else outside of me to help me with that. And I highly recommend that people do that as well. Talk with your protectors, have those conversations. That can be extraordinarily healing, right? Like life-changing, just doing protector work. Going to the exiles and doing the deeper trauma work is the end game and really helps reintegrate and reinvigorate your system with self-energy and like confidence, clarity, calm, connectedness, courage, confidence, presence, persistence, playfulness. Those things can come back alive when you do the exile work as well. So just be careful with the exiles, but definitely go to the protectors.
Yeah, don't do it on your own when it comes to some of that really big stuff. So the protectors are known as firefighters in IFS, right?
Firefighters and managers are the two types.
That's right. So let's say if someone hadn't heard of or that aren't familiar with some of those terms, when we hear inner child work, and correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say if I know that my inner child is wounded, that would actually be potentially the protector inner child. Does that or is that not right?
Maybe. Yeah. So all of our parts are generally little kids. Right. A wounded part, IFS would consider an exile. Mm-hmm. Exiled emotions or exiled parts are holding on to a burden. They are hurt. They're not trying to do anything. They're stuck. They're burdened. Yeah. Protectors, when you ask them, what do you do? They will say, I am protecting you from this. They won't say, I feel stuck. I feel like I'm holding on to this. Protector can become burdened, but their primary goal is to protect you, and they're doing something. Whereas the wounded child or the exiled emotion or a part is holding on to something and stuck. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that really helps. I appreciate that. And so I feel like you touched on maybe a little bit of what I'm going to ask you at the very end, but I wanted to ask you in regards to, and so Pete Walker in his books From Surviving to Thriving, which we talk about all the time on this podcast, talks about the inner and outer critic. He talks about reparenting yourself, refathering yourself, remothering yourself, the really beautiful conversations he's had with this like internal dialogue. So I really suggest reading that book, guys, for exploring some more of these concepts. He mentioned too, so bibliotherapy is a concept that he mentioned for someone like me who is isolated and kind of still trying to figure out new community. I've been kicked out of the left, kicked out of the right. I'm like, I don't really have friends right now, and I'm figuring out myself. So Pete Walker suggests that reading books about CPTSD or finding your Substack article was really cathartic for me. He says that it can be like wise aunts and uncles that can help you feel seen. And that's why I feel seen by reading your articles, even more so by getting to pick your brain by this and be validated that these aren't character flaws if I have some of these things. So do you think that kind of insight can support the healing process, even though it obviously doesn't replace the body-based work?
Oh yeah, for sure. Awareness is the first step, and starting to get some of that validation is generally some of the first stirrings that some of your parts will have, like, oh, this is a real thing, and they feel validated enough to then go maybe reach out and grab help, get help, and talk with somebody and do some of the real work. There is a road where you go down and you start to intellectualize and rationalize and explain. Explaining hurt, being able to rationalize hurt won't heal it necessarily. It'll get you a quick dopamine hit in the moment, but it will not necessarily give you the long-term satisfaction you're looking for. And just in the work that I do, there's a lot of rationalization, intellectualization, explainers, thinkers, figure-it-outers, CEO type parts that I work with, and really help them. You don't have to think about this. It's actually way easier than that. It's just something you could do. You forgot that you could do it. You forgot that you're invincible, but you are. Mm-hmm. And you just have to trust a little bit, and that opens up. So.
Yeah, you said about creating a safety is important. So by reading books and learning and getting validated and being seen, that will definitely be giving that sense of safety, which makes sense that we'll start to open up and be a little bit more trusting. So that does lead me into my next question, which the listeners know over the last 5 years, I've gone through some really difficult seasons. And I've noticed how hard it is to tell if I'm being too guarded, or I typically go too open in my relationship. So I'll share that I've always been an oversharer. And I've been recently noticing that I do that, like to my Pilates instructor, or I'll share something like really vulnerable, like that I was involved in sex work and something like that. And I've done a podcast episode on it. I blog on it. So I obviously talk about this publicly, but I'm like, is it testing emotional safety? I'm still figuring that out on why I do that. So some of us might overshare. Some of us might be too guarded. It's like my nervous system is really trying to figure out who's safe, what's safe. I'm on constant hypervigilance. I'm scanning the environment. It benefits me in some ways. And obviously it's a hindrance mostly though. So for those who have gone through long-term trauma or have complex PTSD, like how do you have any insights on, obviously not giving advice here, but just, overgeneralized big bird's eye view on what's going on in the brain when it feels like my trust system has been so broken? Like, why do I oscillate like this?
Yeah, your trust system is broken, or not broken, but it's damaged at least, and your attachment system is dysregulated. So it makes sense that you are testing some of these things. Your brain is trying to remap areas that don't have any neurons and things. And there are parts of you that are also testing. I would, if that was me, or if it was a client of mine, I would absolutely work with that. Are you oversharing or undersharing? Okay, let's talk to the part of you that is oversharing. What is that part afraid would happen if it didn't do its job? If it didn't overshare, what's its biggest fear? And going down that chain of thought with it, and asking, when did you pick up this role? Do you remember the first time you picked this up? Okay. What was that moment like? Do you remember who you picked it up from or how you learned it? How old do you think that I am right now? And start to ask that. And that could be either one, the overshare or the undershare. Either one, you can ask the same questions to, and start to understand what's going on there mechanistically. What's happening? What are they guarding you against? What are they protecting you against? What are they afraid would happen? How old do they think you are? And what's their hope for you? What's their intention? What are they like? You can ask these things. You don't have to guess. You don't have to, this is because of this brain region, this thing is happening. You can talk to these parts and have a conversation with them, and they'll tell you what's going on and the work that you need to do to help them and bring some self-energy to them. So I'd absolutely suggest people talk to their parts and just ask them.
Yeah. And it might sound a little bit uncomfortable. I've been trying to encourage my husband to do some of that as well. Trying to talk to parts or that inner version of us, like the inner child work that Pete Walker speaks on, because as you said in the beginning, these were adaptive behaviors at some point in some environment we were in, and now it's maladaptive. And that's, the awakening, if you will, of noticing, I'm in charge of the record that I'm putting on this record player. And so that awareness, creating that fork in the road, really is the name of the game. And so just finding compassion for those of us who have had this stuff hijacked. And just my therapist has me working on my own internal dialogue, because I seek so much external validation. He'll ask me how I'm doing, and I literally almost look outside of the world to tell him how I'm doing. And I didn't even notice it was such a blind spot. I was shook because I have next level self-awareness. And I was like, whoa, bro, I have to sit on this concept for a whole week to really wrap my brain around how true that is and how helpful that was for me. And, this just makes sense for those of us who might be listening, who have deconstructed from high control environments, cult-like environments. I wanted to touch on something you mentioned earlier about the default mode network. And that's the part of the brain that's tied to identity and self-reflection, because not having my sense of self got really shifted when I moved from Portland, Oregon. I got married to my husband and we moved to Japan. And so I gave up my personal training career and basically just became an online personal trainer. I left my MLM company. So that was a huge part of my identity. So I didn't really notice that I was becoming like what I wanted, a housewife, a married person, like all these things were shifting, but in turn, my identity got really shook up, which was what opened me up to then be vulnerable to some of these more high control environments that I didn't really realize. So I just feel like unpacking how CPTSD, how I'd like to close down the conversation a little bit more, maybe just for my own catharticism, is like how this impact on our brain impacts the sense of self. It's kind of the whole theme of this conversation. We've talked about parts, fragmentation, being split off into all these different places. And so the journey of working with that is really just coming into wholeness, like releasing some parts, reframing some parts, I guess we could say. But could you just help me from like a neurological level, why healing can feel so slow, and that it's like I'm becoming a new person again. It's almost like the phoenix rising out of the ashes. Can you help us with how trauma impacts the identity and just the concept of self a little bit more and closing down the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it wires you for survival, and your identity becomes survival. To shift from trauma to transformation, from surviving to thriving, you have to become someone new. To get where you never had, you got to do what you never did. You've got to do what you've never done. You've got to become who you've never become before. Like, you've got to become a new version of yourself. Your identity is the largest predictor of your feelings, thoughts, actions, behaviors, beliefs. And so being able to shift who you are and shift that. And the way I like to frame it more is remember who you are, because you are confident, calm, courageous, clear, connected, creative, present, playful, persistent. You are these things. We're born that way. So it's really remembering who you are, and embodying that new identity, and moving through, changing and shifting and creating new neural networks that represent those behaviors, those feelings, those thoughts, those actions. And doing parts work does that. It does affect your neurobiology. And going through this healing process changes and shifts your neurobiology. So it is an identity crisis that you're going through oftentimes, as you're crafting this, but your brain is plastic. You absolutely can shift and change, and grow and heal these things. It's totally possible. No matter what brain network was affected, you absolutely can heal. I've seen it. I've done it with freaking billions of people, or lots of people, not billions, obviously, but I've helped tons of people with it. And you totally can. It is really hard because you're unwiring really soldered in behaviors and feelings and thoughts. And it's painful when you're shifting and changing and pulling away neurons and disconnecting them. It's like getting a cut on your skin. It hurts. And it can be painful, but it's possible. And it's why in trauma recovery, we see this weird graph in trauma recovery. If you look at, on the bottom axis is time, and on the left side is distress. When you're in the trauma, right, the acute trauma, your distress is super, super high. Then you get out of the trauma and your distress over time starts to come down. Then what happens is your external safety increases. And so you start to be able to question, oh, okay, what happened? I need to think about this. What was going on? How do I heal this? How do I think about what just happened to me? And so your distress is coming down and you have more availability to process this stuff. And it's at that moment, generally people get outside help. They meet someone like me. And counterintuitively, their distress might go back up as they're healing trauma and working through some of this stuff, because it can be painful, and it can kind of suck a little bit. And then over time, so that's phase 3, where it increases again, but you're not in the trauma anymore. You're witnessing it and working through deeper wounds. And then over time, it goes up and down, right? It's trending downwards, but distress can spike up and then trend down, and then spike up and trend down as your nervous system is getting back into that green, healthy, good, robust state. Your window of tolerance is opening up and things like that. So, and that is a known chart. That's a trauma recovery chart. So it is a process. You absolutely can do it. But it can kind of suck a little bit at first.
Yeah, almost like anything that's difficult. It's like, contrast is such a powerful teacher. And going through, the book that I mentioned, The Coddling of American Mind, it talks about the 3 untruths that have taken over younger generations. And one of them, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And now, of course, the flip of that is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, which can be a little reductionistic. And especially with the trauma world, we're a little bit not fans of that phrase. But the point of it is finding resiliency again and believing in yourself again is the point. I think the wisdom nugget that can be found in there. And that's what you're encouraging here, is that regardless of how, whether it's the structure that wants to find me, whether it was in a religious experience, whether it was something else like that, if those have fallen away, where you can rebuild from there. I've been researching the concept of nostalgia as well, because nostalgia is, you kind of look back into, even when you were in a negative environment, was there anything that you can, sense of self that you can try to find here in this new identity, trying to connect any dots, is very fascinating concepts to me in regards to not getting stuck in the stinking thinking, I think, is the biggest thing that we can all fall into. And so I really appreciate just this concept of it's going to be hard, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue pushing through that discomfort. It kind of brings me back. I don't know if I finished when I mentioned Sam Miller Science, one of my mentors, talking about obesity rates going through because folks are stressed out and they're not able to walk or to complete the stress cycle, which is what you were saying, that if we get a traumatic event and then we go to sleep and we didn't actually go through the entire stress cycle, which is within your nervous, which is not just your nervous system, but your physical well, your nervous system is your physical body, but you know what I'm saying? The mind and brain are all connected. So waking up in the middle of the night because you still had that stress response going on, that can also contribute to weight gain, is what we were talking about in my, high level coaching. We're seeing that clients are doing all the right things, but aren't seeing results because trauma, the way we're thinking, inflammation, like these things, it's like just the picture is always bigger. And so I just wanted to, it made me think about even that concept here is like trauma is like that little spike of wave is what you were saying there. It's like we're going to be oscillating even when we're going through recovery. And I don't think we're ever going to see a flat line. Even when we're talking about blood glucose monitoring and some of my high level coaching, you don't want a flat line. That means you're dead. Like, no, like even when you're tracking your blood sugar, it's never going to be flat. You're going to have ups and downs. And then, so it's just interesting how when we're tracking data and we can even crave a sense of certainty there, and that looking at patterns and trends and knowing that, regressions or falling back into old patterns or old habits or slipping into something is going to happen. And again, just finding compassion for that. So it's kind of explaining some of those ups and downs on the chart, but really, and what I wanted to say about this polyvagal theory is that you're never always going to be in green. Like that's not the goal of this therapy, your approaches or anyone's approaches is to not have a stressful life. That is a false version of utopia that does not exist. So
Right.
just being able to be more adaptive to stress, which is what you were saying, being able to help your clients understand if they're in the yellow sympathetic, how, or in the red, and how to work through with like going for a walk, doing some humming, going outside, or, holding an ice cube, splashing water on your face. There's all these techniques you can do that can try to help you reactivate your vagus nerve and get that system back online. So I really appreciate that. If you guys haven't looked into the polyvagal theory, then I'll link all these images in the show notes so you guys can follow along. Is there anything you want to add to close down the conversation since we're at the hour? I just really appreciate your time and your expertise, and everything will be linked in the show notes so my audience can find you. A
great book on IFS is No Bad Parts by Dr. Schwartz. I highly, highly recommend that. And there's also one, Transcending Trauma by Dr. Frank Anderson. He's another IFS guru. He's a neuropsychologist who really breaks down complex trauma and neurobiologically with the IFS frame, helping us understand managers are in our prefrontal cortex, firefighters are in our amygdala, right? And really starting to look at IFS through a really cool neuroscience frame, just like I do. So I love those two books if people are interested in IFS stuff. And the IFS directory is on the IFS Institute website. So you can find an IFS practitioner, coach, therapist near you that can help you through this stuff. Cool. I really appreciate that. And as I said, I'm a fan of bibliotherapy, so I'm always looking for more books to read. So thank you so much for that. And thank you guys for listening.